In 2005, author George.R.R. Martin was dubbed the American Tolkien by Time magazine. Since then, the idea that Martin is America's answer to the greatest fantasy writer of all time has become a sort of running motif. You see it on the backs of many editions of his books, it's been said by certain literary critics, and most importantly, it has a unique way of really pissing a lot of people off. Over time, it's become more and more popular to lash out at Martin and accuse him of being disrespectful towards Tolkien. And while this video will ultimately be in defense of certain things Martin has said about Tolkien over the years, on the other hand, I can 100% see why simply comparing Martin to Tolkien in any way gets under a lot of people's skin. And I ain't talking about the Boltons, okay? I ain't talking about the Boltons. Sick fucks. But yeah, comparing Martin to Tolkien is a bit like comparing a king to a god. Martin's great, don't get me wrong, he's written one of the finest fantasies of the 21st century, but he's still definitely not quite at the level of Tolkien himself. Tolkien was a scholar who was deeply passionate about history, mythology, and linguistics. He had served in the First World War where he lost many friends and saw the horrors of battle firsthand, and later went on to become a professor and fellow of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford University, which at the time, less so now but at the time, was the most prestigious institution of learning in the world. Driven by sheer passion and curiosity, Tolkien created his own languages and world and histories and mythology for fun, which set the groundwork for modern fantasy as we know it. While there were other fantasies written before Tolkien going back millennia, and he didn't invent the genre out of thin air by any means, he more or less set in stone all the most fundamental parts of how it's written. There's not a single author trying to write fantasy nowadays who has ever put pen to paper without at least considering The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings as reference, or leaned on them heavily for inspiration. No other writer in this field ever has, or I can say with some degree of confidence ever will, match him. It's impossible. Now, George.R.R. Martin is also a great writer from a different time. He's been writing stories since he was a little kid, growing up in the projects of Bayonne, New Jersey, and went on to have a great career in both literature and TV. He was involved in the protests against America's involvement in the Vietnam War, which he saw as aimless and pointless, a theme he would go on to explore in his own fantasy. He's incredibly well-read, well-traveled, and well-educated, but when it comes to fantasy, it's impossible to really separate his work from the standards set by Tolkien. So calling him the American Tolkien doesn't necessarily mean he's as good as or as influential as Tolkien. It's more of just a really buttery compliment that suggests that his style of combining the grittiness of historical fiction with fantasy will have a strong impact on many writers to come, in a similar way that Tolkien's work did all those years ago. Nothing wrong with that. But with that said, I've seen many people say that George has gotten cocky since the success of A Game of Thrones and got high on his own supply, so to speak, that he's a grifter who only built his fame and success by mindlessly subverting fantasy tropes established by Tolkien, and Martin has gone so far as to criticize some of Tolkien's storytelling decisions in The Lord of the Rings. So is Martin being out of line here? Well, the truth, if you actually watch Martin talk about this stuff and pay attention to the words actually coming out of his mouth, is no, not at all. I've watched bucket loads of interviews and panels where Martin talks about Tolkien, and personally I haven't found anything he ever said to be disrespectful in the slightest. So today we're going to look at 3 instances where Martin has criticized Tolkien and analyze whether or not he took it too far. But before doing that, let's soundly shut down any idea that Martin doesn't respect Tolkien's legacy or thinks he's a better writer or something. Martin has repeatedly stated that, like most fantasy authors in the Western world, Tolkien is his single biggest influence and inspiration. He literally mentions Tolkien's name in every single interview.
I love Tolkien. I read him when I was in junior high school. He had a profound effect on me. He's the father of all modern fantasy. We all are working in the shadow of the great mountain that is Lord of the Rings.
You know, I keep coming back to Tolkien because he was a huge influence on me.
I mean, and Tolkien, which I read when I was young and at a pretty formative age, I think. That book had an immense influence on me. I'm very flattered to be called the American Tolkien. It's the greatest compliment you can give any fantasy writer, Tolkien. Tolkien essentially created modern fantasy. And Tolkien was the first really great world builder. He created Middle-earth in such detail that it seems like a real place to me. Tolkien, and he was also a linguist. He spoke languages, he spoke Old Norse and Old English, and was familiar with linguistic theory. I don't have any of that stuff.
I could go on and on. Martin first read The Lord of the Rings when he was 12 or 13, and clearly he still thinks about it a lot. He always pays tribute to Tolkien. For one, I think he rereads The Lord of the Rings every few years.
But as I reread those books, as I do every few years, the brilliance and the necessity of the scouring of the Shire becomes clearer and clearer to me.
And he recently even flew out to pay his respects at Tolkien's grave. The idea that Martin has no right to talk about Tolkien or that he's somehow insulting his memory by suggesting he's the superior author is completely ridiculous. Let's check out one more quick interview here.
A lot of fantasy takes its lead from Tolkien, who himself was drawing from older medieval myths and tradition. But most of the people who followed Tolkien, including me, were faking it. I mean, Tolkien was the proverbial iceberg where, you know, 9/10 of the structure is below the water. I mean, my iceberg when I started out was some ice piled on a raft. So it gave the illusion of being an iceberg, but there was nothing below the surface.
What we have here is Martin basically admitting that himself and other fantasy authors pale in comparison to what Tolkien achieved. Most fantasy authors just start working on a story, then they sort of stitch together a map, maybe some family trees to make sense of it as they go. Whereas for Tolkien, the very creation of Middle-earth itself was a work of unparalleled passion and knowledge, inspired by his life's work studying languages and history. He already had this entire world created, it existed as a fully fleshed out, real place in his mind, and then he would just write stories that took place in it. Martin is under no illusion that he's competing with that.
Middle-earth becomes a real place and becomes a character.
Across the board, the way he talks about Tolkien just isn't how somebody who's being disrespectful talks. I don't understand why so many people get this mixed up. With that said, though, he does, on occasion, in a tongue-in-cheek sort of way, critique The Lord of the Rings and pick away at things he would personally change about it. So let's take a look at a few times he did that, see if he's being out of line. Perhaps the most famous criticism is that George.R.R. Martin is critical of the generic good versus evil cliché seen in The Lord of the Rings. But if you watch him actually talk about this, he's not blasting The Lord of the Rings itself with this one.
Following Lord of the Rings, fantasy was largely taken over by Tolkien imitators who were delivering Tolkien-like books, but who didn't seem to capture any of the power of Tolkien and just were borrowing some of his tropes. And some of the things that Tolkien did, which I think worked for him, in the hands of these lesser writers, developed into pretty bad cliches. And you know, the whole thing of the Dark Lord is stirring, and his ugly minions are coming out, and you know they're horrible minions because they're ugly and they wear black and
bad.
They have a lot of
bad.
Spikes and stuff on their armor, and you know, and the good guys go forth, and they're all like elves and stuff like that, and they're really pretty, and they wear white, and you know, the world is not that simple.
As you can see, he's not saying it was bad when Tolkien did it, he's saying that it was good when Tolkien did it, but it's been done to death because everyone in fantasy is copying the same formula over and over. So that's not actually a critique of The Lord of the Rings, it's more a critique of how fantasy in general has become somewhat formulaic, and Tolkien's ideas have now become tropes or cliches. Martin has said many times that he prefers stories where the battle between good and evil is fought not between ugly monsters and attractive humans, but within the human heart, how an individual person can exhibit both good and evil qualities because we all have good and evil within us.
You read about war heroes who save their whole platoon and are incredibly brave, and then they go home and they beat up their wives, or they become an alcoholic, or they become a thief and things like that. How do you reconcile that? Well, they're human beings.
And while The Lord of the Rings mostly depicts good guys as a bunch of handsome and brave warriors and bad guys as a bunch of ugly motherfuckers, Tolkien also did explore the battle of good and evil within the human heart. Boromir and Denethor are both characters who represent how greed and the desire for power can corrupt people by overtaking their inner virtues. So yeah, this one isn't really bashing Tolkien, it's more just saying that fantasy has gotten a bit stale in general, and anyone who gets upset about this is probably off their rocker. Now let's take a look at the most famous and probably the biggest example that comes to mind of Martin actually criticizing The Lord of the Rings. He makes the same critique in at least 2 different interviews, and this one sets people on fire, man. But I actually find it very interesting. I'll link both interviews in the description below in case you want to check them out.
Why did you bring Gandalf back from the dead? He should have stayed dead.
The death of Gandalf in the Mines of Moria, when the Balrog drags him down to the thing, and he says, "Fly, you fools!" and that's enormously powerful because you know, especially at that point in the book, because Gandalf is the father figure. Gandalf is the guy who has the answers. Gandalf is the one who knows what they should do and how they should do it. And suddenly he's gone, and now the hobbits are on their own with Strider and Boromir and people they don't necessarily trust because their relationships are still fairly new at that point, and they're facing untold dangers, and they don't have Gandalf to warn them of exactly what's around the next turn in the bend. That's a hugely powerful moment, which I actually, if it had been me, Gandalf would have stayed dead. I think. Bring it. Bringing him back is surprising, but in some ways it undercut the power of that moment.
So as we can see, Martin is critical of Gandalf coming back to life in The Two Towers. Now, some people just get mad whenever somebody says something that's not kiss-ass about Tolkien, but the more commonly cited problem here is that it comes off like Martin doesn't understand Tolkien's work. Because Gandalf coming back wasn't just a gotcha moment like some shock-value Deus Ex Machina. There are genuine, deep, nuanced in-world reasons and a fundamental significance as to why Gandalf came back from the dead. I won't get into that here, but in short, Gandalf is an immortal being with an ordained mission, and his resurrection is all fully explained within the context of the world. But here's the thing. That doesn't mean George isn't allowed to criticize it, or have an opinion about it. Who cares if it's explained in the lore? He thinks it would have made for a more compelling story if Gandalf didn't come back. That's called having an opinion. You can't get mad and say he's being a dick to Tolkien for having an opinion about something he wrote. Everybody has the right to think for themselves, form their own opinions and theories and perspectives, and express them. But perhaps more importantly, criticizing something doesn't necessarily mean you think the whole thing is garbage and you're disrespecting its creator. People criticize the things they love all the time. Just look at the Game of Thrones community. I've seen some of the biggest Thrones fan channels like Alt-Shift-X, Quinn the GM, the Grease Goblins, Order of the Green Hand, Michael Talks About Stuff, In Deep Geek, The Fandom, Talking Thrones, etc. go off about how much they hate certain aspects of the story. I've seen people criticize Quentin's entire storyline, say that Bran's chapters are boring, or that the early Dany chapters drag on for too long and should have been cut down, or that George kept Dany and Meereen for too long and she should have started moving towards Westeros by the end of the 5th book. But that's not being disrespectful, it's just an opinion. So why is Martin not allowed to say one critical thing about his favorite book that he's read like 100 times? That doesn't make any sense. And what's worse, he actually makes a reasonable point here. Like, I disagree with him, I prefer Gandalf to be alive in the final act, but I understand what Martin is saying from a storytelling perspective. When Gandalf falls to his doom, it's a transformative moment in the story that forces characters like Frodo and Aragorn to grow and adapt and carry on his legacy. Then he comes back and starts solving all the problems again. He fixes Theoden up, takes command of the war effort, everybody defers to him for wisdom and guidance, so I kinda see the idea. I'm also glad that Martin felt this way because his thoughts on this led directly to the death of Ned Stark, which I think is the single most important moment in A Song of Ice and Fire. That's what put this series on the map because we all expected Ned to survive or come back in some way, but he doesn't. His head is on a spike, he's not coming back, and Martin explores the long-term consequences of that. Robb and Jon both try to carry on his legacy, his sense of honor and duty, but Ned isn't physically there to help them or guide them, and since they're both so young, they make mistakes, which ultimately lead to both of their deaths. It's a tragedy. This makes Martin's work much different from Tolkien's. It's a lot more grounded in hard reality and history, and I think that scratches an itch that most fantasy authors who copied Tolkien's style for decades often avoided. But unfortunately, this also gives his haters a runway to hurl the hollow criticism that Martin only kills his characters just to be a contrarian to Tolkien, just in a desperate attempt to subvert Tolkien's work. And let me just say, that's some bullshit. He doesn't just kill his characters to subvert Tolkien's work, he does it because, well, for one, it's fun as fuck and makes things exciting for the reader, but also because he likes history and was blending historical fiction with fantasy, and in history, people die. Even Alexander the Great didn't have plot armor, nobody thought he was gonna die. But he did. And then you see people say really stupid shit, like Martin has no creativity, all he did is rip off real-world history like the Wars of the Roses and copied the world map, and then made some small tweaks. I mean, really? Are these people smoking crack backwards? By that logic, you could be a dick and say all Tolkien really did was just rip off Norse mythology, medieval European history, and Beowulf. Where the fuck do these people think he got Middle-earth, the elves, the dwarves, gods, castles, cavalry, enchanted forests, battering rams, siege towers, elephant riders, dragons, cave trolls, monsters, wizards, magic spells, and so on from? You think he just pulled these ideas out of nothing from some vacuous void in his asshole? Both Martin and Tolkien leaned into their inspirations and knowledge to create their stories because that's what fantasy writers do. So yeah, the Gandalf thing, not a big deal. I take no issue with this personally, it's fine. Completely reasonable opinion to have. Finally, our last example is this blurb where Martin rambles on about how Tolkien never explains what Aragorn's policies would be after becoming king. I can't find the actual spoken interview, so I'll put it on screen and read it out to you. He said, Tolkien can say that Aragorn became king and reigned for 100 years and was wise and good. But Tolkien doesn't ask the question, what was Aragorn's tax policy? Did he maintain a standing army? What did he do in times of flood and famine? And what about all those orcs? By the end of the war, Sauron is gone, but all the orcs aren't gone. They're in the mountains. Did Aragorn pursue a policy of systematic genocide and kill them? Even the little baby orcs in their little orc cradles? So here we have Martin musing about how exactly Aragorn planned to rule as king, and people freaked out about this one. The internet got so mad about this. But he's just pondering, dude, and once again, it's interesting to think about, for me at least. Sure, Tolkien sort of goes into it in the appendixes, but he doesn't exactly get deep into the weeds of the politics here. And while I disagree with Martin that Tolkien should have done so, it's still interesting to think about. I mean, we only really see Aragorn as a warrior. He starts off as a Dunedain ranger who wanders and hunts, and then he becomes a brave military commander. But is he well versed in governing a country in times of peace? Sure, he's a good man, but is he politically savvy? And what the fuck is he gonna do about all those orcs? When Frodo destroys the ring, it clearly says that they ran and hid in caves. Tolkien left it ambiguous whether or not small bands of orcs survived into the Fourth Age, hiding in the dark places of the world. So they're not really a threat. But aren't they described as irredeemable, cruel, and violent monsters corrupted by Melkor through torment in the hellish fortress of Udun? And doesn't that just leave open the possibility that some of them can group together and butcher some people? Would it be responsible of Aragorn to show them mercy, knowing the blood of his own people might be on his hands? I don't know, man, fuck. I guess you gotta get in there and finish them off. I hate to say it, but they're orcs. They're intrinsically evil. You can't let them go hiding in the caves. I guess he did have to pursue a policy of, extermination. These are fun questions to ask. He's just pondering and musing on the internet and everybody got so pissed at him. Like, you wouldn't get mad at anyone else for saying this. It's not so much that he's mad at Tolkien for not including this, it's that he's curious about it. He'd like to see that question answered. It puzzles him. Every story ends somewhere, and unfortunately, Tolkien only left us with a little SparkNote summary of the nature of Aragorn's rule after the events of The Lord of the Rings. And I guess that just keeps Martin up at night. This guy is always in thinking mode, you gotta respect that. And I also really like how he asks these questions of Tolkien, and since Tolkien isn't around to answer them and not many other fantasy authors really explore those ideas, like taxes and stuff, Martin has to muse about it himself, and this becomes a part of his own work. Some of my favorite parts of A Game of Thrones are the scheming and conspiring of various characters like Tyrion, Varys, and Littlefinger. At one point, Tyrion finds out that Littlefinger has been borrowing massive amounts of money to basically force the crown into debt, so that when people need money, they have to come to him and owe him favors. It just shows that Martin has different interests and he likes to talk about it. There's literally nothing to be mad about here, in my opinion. As I was wrapping up this video, I realized there's a fourth one I forgot to mention, which was that one time George.R.R. Martin said that his character Jaime Lannister, at full strength and in full armor, could take on Aragorn in a fight. This one is a bit silly, and I literally just remembered it as I was wrapping up editing for this video, but thankfully the channel In Deep Geek has an analysis on this that basically aligns with my thoughts on the matter, so I'll go ahead and link that here and in the description. So yeah, at the end of the day, given all I've said, sure, Martin isn't truly at the same level as Tolkien himself, but isn't it at least fair to say that Martin has the right to talk about Tolkien, disagree with him, deviate from his style, and suggest what he would do differently as a creative spirit, with his own perspectives and preferences, beliefs and emotions? Well, based on all I've said so far, I think you know what my answer to that is at this point, which is no. Because Tolkien finished his books, and Martin's not going to finish his. So yeah. Tolkien wins!